Chapter 16. Literary Encounters. Violet had hoped that, in the coming days, Harry would come to her with the strange diary and share what he'd found, and then Violet could caution him against interacting with it and perhaps even convince him to destroy it. She was sure that Harry would approach her soon. She'd even spent time going over what to say in her head, rehearsing lines of intrigue and suspicion so to seem as natural as possible. That wasn't tree-lilying, as far as Violet was concerned. Just a bit of acting to protect herself from having to reveal what Ginny had told her. And yet, as the days dragged into weeks, Harry didn't come and talk to her about the diary. He spoke of other things, classes and homework, and complaints about Lockhart the usual. Nothing interesting, not even a hint that he was lugging around an extremely dangerous and manipulative magical notebook. As frustrated as Violet was, she was downright carefree when compared to poor Ginny Weasley, who looked on the verge of a breakdown every time she set eyes on Harry. There were dark circles under her eyes, and Violet frequently caught her gnawing anxiously at what was left of her fingernails. Ginny would stare at Violet as well, across the great hall during mealtimes, a pair of wild, nervous eyes boring into her from the other side of the room was enough to put Violet on edge at the best of times. As the Easter holidays rolled around, Violet and the rest of the second years were given a brand new source of stress. The time had come to choose their subjects for the third year, a matter that Cassius stressed to them should be taken very seriously. "It could affect your whole future," he told Violet and Tracy as they pored over lists of new subjects, making them with checks. "So we keep all our old subjects too?" Violet asked, wanting to be sure she understood things right. Cassius nodded. "Those are core classes, so yeah. You'll be stuck with those all the way through 7th year." "Ooh, care of magical creatures," Tracy exclaimed, reading further down the list than Violet had. She nudged Violet's shoulder pointedly. "Maybe we'll get to study some of those horribles monsters you like so much." "I don't like them," Violet muttered, her face feeling rather hot. "I just think they're neat, that's all." Violet and Tracy did sign up for care of magical creatures in the end, because Cassius assured them it was a fun and interesting class on its own merit, and they would, in fact, be meeting all sorts of strange and terrible monsters. For the rest of her classes, Violet chose the subjects that her mother had studied. Arithmancy and ancient runes were the subjects covered in the stack of books Violet had been mysteriously given at Christmas during her first year at Hogwarts. Their pages were covered with scribbles and notations written in a loopy, pleasant handwriting that Violet had been doing her best to emulate, and on the inside covers was written a single short phrase that made Violet's heart skip a beat every time she looked at it. "This book belongs to Lily Evans." Violet signed up for her subjects with certainty. She'd read each book cover to cover multiple times, and with her mother's notes, she'd been able to understand most of the content. It felt right to follow in her mother's footsteps. In Violet's mind, it brought them closer than they could ever really be. When the Quidditch season began again, and Harry still showed no signs of telling her about Tom Riddle's diary, Violet finally had enough. She waited on the marble staircase, foot tapping angrily, until Harry and his friends passed by on the way down to the Quidditch pitch. Violet stepped out in front of her brother and glared at him. "You've been keeping secrets," she accused firmly. "That's not fair, and I think it's well past time you let me in on it, don't you?" Harry's mouth fell open in shock. "What makes you think I'm keeping secrets?" he said, and Violet prodded him hard in the chest. "Because I'm your sister, Harry, and I know when you're hiding things from me because you don't do a very good job of it. You're not getting yourself into trouble again, are you?" "Harry, I really mean it. I'm not getting into trouble, I swear," said Harry quickly. He looked around at Ron and Hermione to back him up. Ron nodded enthusiastically, but Hermione was doing a poor job of covering the skeptical grimace on her face. "Look, I'll tell you all about it after the match, all right? I promise." "We'll meet up at the pitch, and I'm not going to the match today," Violet said. "If you've got better things to do than keep me in the loop, then I have better things to do than watch you fight to stay on your bloody broomstick." When you're ready to talk, you can come find me in the library." And then she turned smartly on her heel and stomped back up the staircase, leaving Harry staring after her in shock. She felt a bit rotten for snapping at him like that, and even more so for missing out on the game of Quidditch. But this was important, and Harry had been awfully distant anyways, even if he weren't hiding something from her. They needed to have a talk, twin to twin. Then everything would be set right. The library was completely empty when Violet arrived. Even Madame Pince had left her desk, and the entire rest of the school was down at the Quidditch pitch waiting for the game to start. In silence, Violet resumed her search through the shelves and stacks for any more books about monsters that might give her insight to what it was that had been terrorizing the school. She had just shoved a large, heavy tome bound in flaking brown scales back onto the shelf when somebody called her name. "Violet," whispered a familiar voice from what sounded like a few shelves over. "Are you here?" "Hermione," Violet called, stepping back out into the aisle. Sure enough, Hermione Granger was creeping around the corner, alone and wringing her hands in excitement. "What are you doing here? I thought you were watching the game." Harry heard the voice again, Hermione said, her eyes bright and focused. "On the stairs, he said he heard it talking about killing again, and I realized, oh, I've been so stupid. It all makes sense." Hermione looked around nervously before stepping forward and whispering, "I need your help getting into the restricted section. I think I know what's been causing the attacks." Violet was stunned. According to Harry, Hermione was the most upstanding, rule-obeying person he had ever known, and now she wanted to break into the forbidden part of the library. "What do you need me to do?" Violet asked, grinning. It was painfully simple to get into the restricted section. While Violet slipped on her ghost ring and stepped right through the metal gate that separated this portion of the library from the rest of it, Hermione stood watch and whispered out the name of the book that they needed to find. Violet was very careful not to touch any of the books on the shelves without reading their titles. The last time she and Harry had gone looking in the restricted section, the first book they grabbed had screamed so loudly Filch had heard them and come running from across the castle. And any old book that had to be attached to its shelf by a metal chain was not something that Violet cared to pry into. Fortunately, the book that she was told to find was not held down in chains, nor was it as tattered and blood-stained as some of its fellows seemed to be. The title was etched in flaking gold leaf down the thick spine Bestiarium Magicum. It was bound in pale leather that was strangely soft to the touch, and it was very, very heavy. Violet slipped off her ring, tucked the old book under her arm, and put the ring back on her pointer finger. As expected, along with her clothes and her body, the book turned a ghostly, transparent silver and passed straight through the gate with her. Hermione squealed with glee at the sight of it. "I should have known all along," she said, taking the book from Violet's hands and resting it on a nearby table. "Look, I'll show you." The pages were very thin and delicate, though the printed ink stood out dark and clear on the paper as Hermione flipped quickly through the tome. Violet caught glimpses of full illustrations of nightmarish creatures lying in wait, feasting on unfortunate prey, dead and dissected to display their gruesome anatomy. Hermione was flipping through pages at a blinding speed, and then, aha, she pushed the book toward Violet, who read, "Of the many fearsome beasts and monsters that roam our land, there is none more curious or more deadly than the basilisk, known also as the king of serpents. This snake, which may reach gigantic size and live many hundreds of years, is born from a chicken's egg, hatched beneath a toad. Its methods of killing are most wondrous, for aside from its deadly and venomous fangs, the basilisk has a murderous stare, and all who are fixed with the beam of its eye shall suffer instant death. Spiders flee before the basilisk, for it is their mortal enemy, and the basilisk flees only from the crowing of the rooster, which is fatal to it. It's a giant snake," Violet breathed, staring at the accompanying illustration of the massive, writhing coils of a great serpent. "Of course it's a giant, bloody snake. That's why Harry can hear it." She turned to Hermione, who was beaming. "Harry's right, you are brilliant. But look at this." Hermione said, now blushing brightly as she pointed out the passage. All who are fixed with the beam of its eye shall suffer instant death. But Narbonadius looked it in the eye yet. Carlin was found with his camera. Justin Finch-Fletchley must have looked through nearly headless Nick. And Nick couldn't de-again. Right. And do you remember when we found Mrs. Norris? There was water all over the floor. She must have seen its reflection on the floor. That's why they're all petrified. Oh, Violet, we've solved it. We can tell Dumbledore and he'll know what to look for now. Does it say how to kill it? Violet asked. Besides the cock's crow, oh, the roosters, Hermione, something's been killing Hagrid's roosters. I know, said Hermione excitedly. It all fits. I can't believe nobody's figured it out before this book has just been sitting here all these years, and sure Lasomio must have checked it out and read it. The Chamber of Secrets was first opened 50 years ago. How could it have taken this long to solve it? Violet was struck with a thought. Myrtle, she said suddenly. Moaning Myrtle when I asked her how she died, she said there was a boy's voice speaking in a different language, and when she looked out to tell him off, that's when she died. That must have been the heir of Slytherin setting the basilisk on her. Wait, what? Hermione said, eyes widening. Moaning Myrtle was the girl who was killed 50 years ago. She told you that. Of course, said Violet. I went and talked to her after the Death Day party. And she just told you how she died, said Hermione incredulously. Violet nodded. Myrtle was glad to talk about it, really. She said no one had ever asked her before. Hermione's mouth opened and closed several times like a fish out of water gasping for air before finally snapping shut. It was clear the little cogs of her mind were working furiously. Moaning Myrtle died in the bathroom, muttered Hermione. And a massive, ancient serpent has been moving through the school undetected. I wonder. All around the library, little quills and ink pots were set up on the tables and desks. Hermione grabbed one of them now, and before Violet could protest, started scribbling in the margins of the old tome. Pipes, she said proudly, showing Violet the little diagram she had drawn of a snake wiggling its way through a series of tubes. Hermione had also helpfully written the word pipes next to the drawing. She grinned back at Violet. Hogwarts is full of old pipes and tunnels from when they implemented proper plumbing in the 1700s. I'll bet the basilisk has been using them to get around without being seen. How on earth do you know when Hogwarts installed its plumbing? Violet asked faintly. Hermione's cheeks went pink again. It's in Hogwarts, a history. I just thought it was interesting. Violet certainly understood taking an interest in obscure things that other people might find insignificant, but plumbing, really? The two girls stared awkwardly at one another for a moment. Hermione cleared her throat and looked away. All right, so we've got enough proof then. We can take this to Professor Dumbledore. As Violet watched in further alarm, Hermione grabbed hold of the page about basilisks and tore it straight from the book. And make him talk to Moaning Myrtle, and then, distantly, they heard the double doors of the library click open. Both girls hushed themselves immediately. There was a long, tense moment of silence, and then the sound of quiet footsteps could be heard moving up the center aisle. Slow and soft, not at all like Madame Pince's sharp, efficient steps. But who would be coming into the library when the Quidditch game was going on? Violet moved to peek around the corner and see who it was, but was stopped by Hermione grabbing hold of her arm. The other girl shook her head fiercely, face pale, and pointed to her own eyes. She mimed bringing her finger across her throat and stuck out her tongue, and Violet understood at once. If she looked and the basilisk was there, it would kill her instantly, but only if she looked directly at it. As the footsteps drew nearer, Violet gave Hermione a gentle shove back toward the end of the row. The pair of them edged around the bookcase, keeping quiet and close together. Violet dug her hands into the pocket of her robes, searching frantically for something she knew to be there. And then she found it. Smooth and flat, Violet closed her hand around the small, circular mirror that Harry had given her for Christmas. She held it up to show Hermione, who nodded vigorously in understanding. As they edged nearer to the corner, Hermione took the mirror from Violet's hand and very carefully stuck it around the corner. She tilted it back and forth for a moment, then pulled it back and nodded at Violet. Very quickly, Violet and Hermione dashed across the aisle and hid behind the end of the next bookcase. Hermione stuck the mirror out again and tilted it. Violet fidgeted, waiting for the all clear. Hermione was holding her breath as she looked around the corner through the small mirror. She must have seen something to be waiting as long as she was. As she stood there, anxiously waiting, Violet realized something chilling. The footsteps had stopped. "Is it safe?" Violet breathed, leaning close to whisper into Hermione's ear. But Hermione didn't answer. Her hand was still held out around the edge of the bookshelf, mirror angled in her palm. When Violet nudged her anxiously, Hermione didn't move at all. When Violet pinched her, she didn't even flinch, and she still wasn't breathing. Violet ran. Her feet pounded on the wooden floor of the library, breaths coming fast and shallow with fear. Blind panic was surging through Violet's veins. As she sprinted toward the double doors, she had no plan, no idea of where to run or what to do. All she knew was that she had to get away. She had to warn people and get help for Hermione, and as Violet skidded around the corner, she stopped herself just in time to avoid running into a small figure standing in the middle of the aisle. "Ginny," Violet gasped, grabbing the girl by the shoulders. "Ginny, we have to go. The monster is here. It's not safe." Ginny Weasley wasn't looking at her. She didn't appear to be looking at anything at all. Her face was corpse-white and slack, and she was very cold to the touch. Violet searched for any signs of life in Ginny's glazed, unfocused eyes. For a moment, seeing a flicker of movement reflected back at her in the irises, and then Violet's nose was extremely itchy. That was what it felt like at first, a hot, intense itch that was slowly spreading across her face, across her cheeks, and down her throat. Violet tried to swallow. Her mouth was so dry she could barely feel her own tongue, and there was a terrible taste in the back of her throat. Sharp and metallic, it burned all the way down to her stomach. The itching sensation was racing across her arms and legs now like a forest fire crossing a field, singeing everything in its path. With great difficulty, Violet coughed. "Oh, thank heavens," said a woman's voice from above her. Violet's vision was strangely cloudy. It hurt to blink, her eyes were so dry, but she couldn't understand why they would be. She was in the library with Hermione, and they'd found out immediately. Fear clenched around Violet's heart. "Ginny," she croaked, trying to move. Her limbs were extremely stiff and uncooperative, and it didn't feel like she was standing upright anymore. "Easy now, dear, easy," said the same woman's voice. Violet felt something cold pressed to her forehead and gasped. Her skin still felt like it was on fire. "You'll be stiff for a while yet, I'm afraid." Where's Violet's throat felt as though it were packed with sawdust. She could make out dark shapes moving around her now, hovering over her body. She realized she was lying down, but couldn't begin to explain how she'd got there. "Where's the monster?" "Not here," said another familiar voice, a man's this time. Violet blinked rapidly to bring the moisture back to her eyes, and slowly the figures above her came into focus. One of them was Madame Pomfrey, who was now dabbing at her face with a damp rag, and the other was Professor Snape, holding an empty beaker that contained the remnants of some dark, reddish-brown fluid. Violet realized she was in the hospital wing. "Was I petrified?" she asked, her voice still coming out horribly weak and scratchy. Madame Pomfrey's face softened into a smile. "Yes, dear, I'm afraid you were," she said. "But it's over now, don't you worry." "How long?" Violet tried to sit up, but found her spine still felt extremely rigid. She flopped back against the soft mattress with a huff while Madame Pomfrey tutted at her. "I did warn you about the stiffness, didn't I? Give the potion time to work before you go and hurt yourself." "How long?" Violet asked again, more loudly. She was feeling very heavy, but also very riled up. Ginny could still be out there, and if Dumbledore hadn't been told about the basilisk, "Yet you were found in the library," said Professor Snape from beside her, "along with Miss Granger, over 3 weeks ago. The two of you were brought to the hospital wing and have been here ever since." "Hermione," Violet gasped. She tried to sit up again, this time faring well enough to actually lift her head from the pillow. "Is she—" "I'm here," called another weak, shaky voice from across the room. In the bed opposite Violet, Hermione was sitting up in bed, waving with one hand and holding a nearly empty glass of water in the other. She looked fully alive and unharmed, and Violet let out a great sigh of relief. The feeling was cut short as she registered exactly what Professor Snape had told her. 3 weeks, said Violet incredulously. Her voice cracked, sending her into a fit of painful coughs. Madame Pomfrey tutted again and pushed a glass into her hands. It was full of cool, clear water, which Violet drank greedily to try and put out the flames that were still tearing through her insides. When the glass was empty, she shoved it back into Madame Pomfrey's hands. "Where's Harry?" was Violet's next question. She started trying to push the blankets off of herself, fighting Madame Pomfrey all the while. "I want to see Harry, let me go. Mr. Potter is meeting with the headmaster as we speak," said Professor Snape, standing awkwardly to the side as Violet squirmed her way out of the matron's grasp. "He'll surely come visit you once you're fully recovered, Miss Potter. Not if I get to him first," Violet grunted as she slipped off the edge of the bed. Her feet hit the floor, and then so did the rest of her, as her legs had just collapsed out from under her. "That's enough," cried Madame Pomfrey. She came around the bed and grabbed Violet beneath the armpits, lifting her easily back into the hospital cot. "My goodness, girl. Settle down now and stay put, or I'll have to petrify you again for your own good." The blankets were thrown back over Violet's stiff, aching legs and tucked in tightly for good measure, and she was left to do nothing but pout as Madame Pomfrey and Professor Snape went round, attending to the rest of the petrified students. Even when all the stiffness and painful itching had gone, "I swear, I'm fine now." They were all contained in the infirmary until evening rolled around, forced to bend their arms and legs and take deep breaths until their lungs hurt to prove that they were fully unpetrified. They all walked together, Violet, Hermione, Justin Finch-Fletchley, Colin Creevey, and an extremely baffled, nearly headless Nick down to the great hall. The murmurs and voices could be heard from halfway up the marble staircase, and as soon as the doors swung open and the five stepped inside, Violet had taken 5 steps into the great hall when, footsteps growing louder as they drew closer, she was nearly knocked off of her feet by the force of Tracy's crushing hug. It was pandemonium. Friends of the petrified students were all rushing forward at once to greet them. Violet could barely breathe with the force of Tracy's arms around her, and the air was knocked out of her all over again when Cassius arrived and enveloped them both in his long, lanky arms. Sweetest of all was Harry's hug. He pushed past everyone around Violet and lifted her clear off her feet. She flung her arms around him as well, tears of happiness streaming down her face. Before letting them go, Madame Pomfrey had shared the news that the monster was no longer a threat to anyone, and that the Chamber of Secrets had been sealed for good, all thanks to Harry. When Violet asked what all had happened while she was out, the answers came in a rush of words from both Harry and Ron. They'd found the page Violet and Hermione had taken from the library and understood what the word pipes meant, and then they'd followed the spiders into the forest and found Ron's dad's car there, and Tom Riddle was actually, who all along, and Harry had a sword, and Harry killed the basilisk, and Harry had Nearlidied, and Lockhart had lost his whole memory, and something about Lucius Malfoy and Darby Ansax. It was far too much for Violet to take in at once. She hadn't been able to stop crying since stepping into the great hall, and the arrival of Hagrid only set her off again. Harry and Ron said that he had been blamed for opening the Chamber of Secrets for some absurd reason, to the point that the Minister of Magic himself had come and taken him to Wizard Jail. Hagrid certainly did seem a bit thinner than last Violet had seen him, and there were dark circles under his eyes, even as they gleamed with joy at seeing everyone running up to greet him. Violet was too happy to even care that Slytherin didn't win the House Cup. Her heart sank slightly when Professor McGonagall announced that all exams had been cancelled as a school treat, but soared again when Dumbledore announced that, unfortunately, Professor Lockhart would not be returning to his post next year. Quite a few teachers joined in the cheering that greeted this news. The rest of the final term passed in a haze of blazing sunshine. Hogwarts was back to normal, with only a few small difference. Defense against the dark arts classes were cancelled, and Lucius Malfoy had been sacked as a school governor. Harry explained to Violet exactly what had happened with Ginny and Riddle's diary and how Mr. Malfoy was responsible for it all. Draco was no longer strutting around the school as though he owned the place. On the contrary, he looked resentful and sulky. On the other hand, Ginny Weasley was perfectly happy again. She apologized to Violet over and over, no matter how many times Violet assured her she held no ill will. She'd seen Ginny's eyes in the library that day before being petrified. There was no consciousness there, no hint of malice or awareness of what she was doing. It was as though she were under a trance. That's exactly what it was, as Violet later learned, her poor little soul being drained and used by Lord Voldemort himself. Too soon, it was time for the journey home on the Hogwarts Express. Violet, Tracy, and Cassius spent their last remaining hours in which they were allowed to do magic, before the holiday practicing their seize and pull charm and whipping small objects across the room at high speeds toward one another. They played Exploding Snap and practiced disarming each other by magic, along with Harry, Hermione, and all the Weasleys. Harry was getting especially good at it. On the train, Violet joined Tracy and Cassius in a compartment to themselves, talking and laughing and enjoying each other's company for as long as they had left. As the Hogwarts Express began to slow, Tracy grabbed a quill and parchment and quickly scribbled out her phone number and address down on a piece of paper. "Yauhavito, come and visit this time," she said to Violet, shoving the paper into her hand. "I can't stand another month without talking to you, let alone two. Do you promise?" "But the Dursleys," Violet started, flushing uncomfortably. "Iwanto, come see you, but they might not let me." "Then give Mayor address," Tracy said, "and I'll have my dad drive us to see you instead." "You're mad," said Violet. A grin was spreading across her face. "I can't wait to see the Dursleys' faces." "He won't be seeing either of you," Cassius drawled. He was sprawled entirely across the whole seat opposite Violet and Tracy, still dressed in his wizard's robes. "Mother and I are going to Spain for the summer, so I might not even get any of your letters until we get home." What a shame it'd be, coming back to the house and finding no letter waiting at all. "Of course we'll write," Tracy said. "Won't we, Violet?" "That's what you said last year," Cassius sniffed, pretending to examine his fingernails. He shot a wink at Violet. "Course, I don't suppose a madhouse elf can be planned for, eh?" "Shove off," Violet muttered, though she couldn't hide her grin. "Maybe next time it'll be a mad goblin or a mad dwarf. Surely some of them are still out for revenge after what Lockhart put them through." The three of them were still laughing as the train pulled to a stop at King's Cross Station. Fred and George helped Violet unload her trunk and took turns mussing up her hair before saying goodbye. Violet met up with Harry, who was saying his own goodbyes to Ron and Hermione, and smiled bravely at him. "Ready to go home?" she asked her brother. Harry smiled wistfully back at her. "Never," he said, and together they walked back through the gateway to the Muggle world.